Alrighty. Good morning and welcome to WIO webinars. We are excited to have you join us today. My name is Laura and I'll be your host. Joining me today is WIO's head of product marketing, Alex, and Mark, who leads solution engineering. Mark and Alex's presentation will be around 40 minutes long, and we will have time at the end of the session for a Q&A. If you have any questions throughout the event, please feel free to leave them just in the chat box on the right-hand side of the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And now, without further ado, Alex and Mark, I will hand it over to you guys.
Great, thanks, Laura. And great to be here, and thanks everyone for joining in this conversation. This is going to be really a conversational approach to this topic, because rather than overwhelming you with slides and bullet points, we really want to talk through some of the important issues related to collaboration and why securing that kind of enterprise communication is so important and urgent right now. But let's just start with some introductions. For myself, as Laura said, I am the head of product marketing at Wire. And the perspective I'm bringing into this, it comes from a background in the internet related to networking, communications, and the security around that. I've touched on security in my career related to email security, to broad-based sort of distributed denial of service types of attacks, various other sort of insidious attack forms, as well as some encryption and other technologies related to security. So I bring some of that point of view into this. I've been at Wire now for coming up on about 1.5 years, and it's been really fascinating to look at this landscape change from a point of view of security, but also in terms of how that influences the way that we work and the way that we think about all the data that is being exchanged in these really important internal communications. So that's a little bit about me. And Mark, maybe you can introduce yourself before we get into the rest of this.
Sure, of course. Thanks, Alex, for bringing me into this conversation. I'm really looking forward to this. The angle that I'm bringing is I'm coming from a communication and collaboration background. This is where I worked with companies in that space for quite a while now, looking at both angles, like the communication on the one hand, chat, messaging, video conferences, audio conferences, but then also the collaboration angle, like really looking at how can we exchange documents in a safe environment. So security was always top of mind for me in every company that I used to work for, but never as much as it is now with Wire, which is super interesting. This approach that Wire is taking is, I think, pretty unique at the market. We're really raising the bar on a couple of things, and that's also what got me excited to join Wire roughly 4 months ago now.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I think whether it's from the background I've had mostly with startups and networking, IT and security, and yours and more that collaboration and communication space, the value of what's being communicated, the higher the value, the higher the risk. And that leads into really the first topic, which is, why is this topic, digital collaboration, why has this become an urgent problem? What's the scope of the problem? Why are we saying that this is a new level of attack surface? I mean, it's not like it's never been an attack surface before, but I think it's not been regarded as a prime attack surface in the past. But now the concerns about it are arising. Why is that? What do we need to be concerned about? So maybe I'll kick off with that question, because I think if that's the foundation of all of this, is the level of need to pay attention because there's real risks. So maybe you could kick us off with some of your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think the importance really comes a lot from the security vulnerabilities that we have seen. I think this is one of the key things. I mean, we could talk about a number of incidents that have happened just in the last couple of years. And I think, like, from my perspective, and also from, if you look at the way this has evolved, it's becoming more and more, because really communication is a central thing for every company. If you get access to that communication, you're inside the company and you can really do whatever you want. So we have seen a couple of security compromises. We could just talk about one thing. I mean, the signal gate topic, that's one of the ones that comes to mind, like, as one of the first things, where it's just where you have people in a chat that don't belong in the chat. There are several reasons why those kinds of things happen, but the possibility that it was, or the topic that this was possible at all, this is what got me concerned in the first place. And I was thinking about, hey, why are those things happening? Why are people using tools that are not meant for the context they are used in, like, that are not super secure, that are not made, like, that don't have end-to-end encryption, that don't have very strong security measures? And, like, from my experience, what I'm seeing is that in a lot of companies, IT just has nothing to offer. It's like there is nothing from a secure perspective that comes from IT. And if people, also an observation from my perspective, when people have to communicate, and they have to communicate in every type of context, then they will find a way, and they will always look for the easiest way to communicate with each other. And the easiest way is sometimes just the tools that you are using on a day-to-day basis anyway, because they are the consumer tools. The issue with those tools is what we have seen. People can get in those tools. Not only can they get hacked, but also sometimes you just get people in that you don't want in there.
Yeah, and just to be clear, what we're talking about here is, there's lots of ways to communicate, obviously, but we're talking about real-time communication, the kind of communication that is happening that we're used to. I mean, if you could think about it, text messaging, right, SMS, but in the world of apps, this is sort of the instant style messaging. And on a consumer basis, that's WhatsApp, that might be Signal, and other things like that. And there are corporate forms of this. But one of the things you point out is that in many cases, IT has not caught up at all. And there's not really a good platform for real-time communications, or it's so administratively difficult to make things happen that people just go outside and do what is often called shadow IT, right? And they use a consumer app like WhatsApp or Signal, and these aren't built for enterprise use. So there's no way to control who gets in the room, as it were, in the case of Signalgate. So I'm curious, because in your role, you are talking to customers all the time who are starting to confront these kinds of issues. How common is this issue of employees turning to consumer tools?
So if I had to rank the reasons why customers come to us, especially business customers, I would say it's probably ranked on the very first. It's one of the very first topics that come up. The reason is it's not controllable, but everybody knows it's there. And people are getting concerned because of exactly the breaches that we have seen in the past, especially in the past 1 or 2 years.
Right.
And IT is getting concerned. Like, they know that they right now eventually don't have anything that they can offer. And that's why they are looking for a solution in that context. So I think this is one of the key things, is like really the security aspect of it, the breaches that we've seen in the past. But there are also, of course, a couple of other topics that we are seeing, and why companies are approaching us and why they want our help in implementing a very secure solution. I think there's also a topic that you have seen in the past, like this topic of fallback communication, crisis communication, out of band communication. Is this something that you've seen, Alex?
Well, I mean, I think I want to just explore just slightly more, because we see the rogue use of consumer apps. And first of all, one of the reasons why, this topic is getting so much attention is because it's become clear that the kind of, like, as you said, the kind of things that people are discussing internally can have extremely high value. You could be discussing the new the new product, the new technology, intellectual property, legal or contractual things, customer things, secrets, classified information, and in a government or other setting, you could be dealing with regulated private data, or something that could be extremely damaging from a there's a lot of value that people forget that this is exchanging. So when you talk about a concern about WhatsApp, you really don't want that kind of communication happening on WhatsApp. But the other thing I would say is that there also are corporate tools like your Slacks or Microsoft Teams or things like that. And the problem is that they really don't have a very strong orientation towards security. And so we've seen some major compromises. So some time back, Disney had a terabyte of data extracted, exfiltrated from its business, because from what we can tell, an admin who had complete access to all the Slack messages, right? There was no sort of really protection from a godlike administrator, and that person got compromised one way or another. And all of a sudden, this huge amount of very sensitive data was exfiltrated. And we've seen some other examples of insider threats, people being able to access, very sensitive communications about customers, like in the case of Rippling and Deal, where there was, at least allegedly, it's accused, right, that there was some corporate espionage that happened, between competitors and snooping on sensitive topics and Slack channels. And these are some examples of ways that corporate forms of messaging that might have some perimeter protection. You can, not just anyone can enter in, like in the case of Signalgate, but otherwise they're extremely exposed to compromise. So there's more and more examples of these sorts of things happening, where it's not just WhatsApp that's concerning, but I think there's some rising awareness that when a tool is built for open collaboration, but has very little security, it creates a fair amount of risk. So I wanted to just point those things out.
Can I ask you a quick question on that directly here? Because, I mean, if you think about, and this is one thing that you mentioned, like the value of data is becoming increasingly important. Do you see like a relationship between the value of the data that is being shared, or the information that is being shared, and then the impact of abuse? Is that something that you see?
Well, I mean, one of the things, if you look at security practice, is that hackers and things like that are the sensational sort of ways that data gets breached, and nation state actors. And of course, those are very dangerous actors. But I think when you think about how do most breaches happen, there can be attacks, but oftentimes it comes down to human error, right? Or insider, it's like human risk factors, right? And whichever way it happens, the cost of a data breach is pretty high. The average cost calculated by IBM is about 4.4 million, let's say 4.4 million euros, something like that. So it's pretty sizable. That's an average. And obviously some are much more costly. And in the case of, let's say, fines, they can be even higher. So I think there's a lot of categories of damage. That's the economic way to summarize it. But you can think of the brand damage, sort of intellectual property loss, competitive issues, things like that can be extremely disruptive to a business. So I think there is, this level of data getting into the wrong hands is probably in some ways more impactful than just a particular system getting compromised. It's the crown jewels of internal discussion in an enterprise.
One thing that I've seen in that context, and I really experienced that firsthand, it wasn't me, but someone in the company that I was working for, we actually had an external attack. Like we had it wasn't really a ransomware attack. It was people that wanted to steal our credentials, and they actually infiltrated the email system. So they got access to one email account inside the company. And what they actually did is, and that was super sophisticated, they acted on behalf of that person that they hacked, which then meant, hey, the first level of communication that you usually have in companies, the email system, that wasn't usable anymore for us because it was compromised. And then we were looking at, hey, what can we do? Where can we go? And it was actually, even though it was highly secured, including two-factor authentication, somehow attackers got in there. And I think this is also one thing that we're seeing, is that bad actors are getting more and more sophisticated, and they're really attacking the systems where they see the most value of getting in, like email, but also, of course, like the messaging services like Slack and Teams and other tools.
I think one of the things you just pointed out is that attackers are going to attack, compromises will happen. They are, one of the interesting conversations I had recently is, just the likelihood, right, of, email is completely publicly exposed. So it's likelihood of compromises happening via email is, it's very common. It's one of the primary ways for attackers to compromise people and systems. And what happens is, if they can compromise that kind of system, then what becomes a question, like, how do you deal with that? And do you have any fallback to those primary systems? And that, if an organization has not thought that through carefully, then when inevitably attacks do occur, there's no place to turn to. So I think that, and you brought this up earlier, is whether it's fallback, or you call it out-of-band communications, or crisis communications. Crisis communications is maybe a little bit larger category than just fallback or out-of-band, but it's, there are many cases where you need someplace segmented to be able to communicate effectively internally when primary systems are down or compromised, or locked up by ransomware or things like that. I think that's becoming a growing concern, just because of how common these compromises are becoming.
Absolutely. And this is also the feedback that we're getting from customers and prospects. Like, if I would say the security aspect is topic number one, why companies are approaching us, the fallback communication is probably number two. Because, I mean, let's be clear here, everybody already has solutions in place for messaging. Are they secure? Well, some of them are, some of them aren't, or more or less. We are offering a super secure way of communication. The reason they approach us, though, is even if they have something in place already, they need something for certain situations. And also some of the situations that we are experiencing, at least it feels like a little bit more, when, for example, strategic tools or strategic infrastructure components are down. Like, if AWS is down, if Cloudflare is down. We had those incidents recently, like just last week, I think, when Cloudflare.
We had more than one Cloudflare outage, I think, recently. Yeah. Right? Yeah, I mean, it was a bad run of luck for them.
Yeah, well, then things are not working, right? But you still need to communicate. You need to be able to communicate. And this is where we can come in also with a solution that is completely independent of all of the infrastructure. You can have wire as one of the examples for highly secure communication in the cloud, obviously, but you can also have it on premise. And you need to think about that when, like, really establishing your super secure systems. You need to think about fallback communication, crisis communication. What happens, and like, things being down, like, or infrastructure being down is only one of those things. It can also be like the compromises, like compromised systems. It can also be natural disasters and various other things. Is there anything else that you have seen in that context, Alex?
Well, I mean, I think the other thing that is becoming an issue, and I think from a European perspective in particular, is that there's a category of potential outages that is now rising due to, sadly, geopolitical tensions. And thankfully, so far, that is not commonplace. But I think it's become a risk factor that now maybe not so long ago you would not have considered, but it is now. a considerable risk factor in terms of the potential that accounts or access to services could be pulled because of geopolitical tensions for some reason. So I think that's another thing that is heightened awareness that many of these primary systems, oftentimes which are either delivered by or completely dependent on, let's just say, big tech providers, are vulnerable at multiple levels. Yeah, systemic outages, natural disasters, things like that. But also other factors that have nothing to do with tech and everything to do with, let's just say, more of the human side of issues.
Yeah, absolutely true. And we've already seen the first instances where this happened, right? And you're 100% right. It's super sad to see this, but it's still something that you need to consider when you're looking at like the risks that are currently taking place.
Right, because what we're talking about now is IT resilience, and that oftentimes, the big topic, the way this is addressed is the notion of digital sovereignty. But a lot of what that means is sovereignty is being able to control your own destiny, right? And control of your data, control of your systems, and having resilience is now become more complicated for IT leaders to think about. But you can't ignore all these factors. So I think another major thing I pick up is regulatory and compliance changes. The regulatory landscape let's just say it's thickened with requirements, right? There's more and more. Now, there is, when you talk about sovereignty, there is a lively conversation and good conversation to be had about, the side of controls versus innovation, right? But the reality is that if you are in certain industries, well, first of all, there are overarching, like GDPR, overarching regulations about how you need to treat data and certain categories of data. But there's also other ones that are springing up, particularly for, I think, critical industries. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what you are seeing in that and how customers that you're talking to are thinking about that these days.
Yeah. So, of course, regulations are top of mind for everyone right now. And there are a couple of reasons. I mean, you already mentioned GDPR, super important, overarching principles of that need to be implemented. What we're seeing quite a bit is NIS2, which then regulates also communication and also backup communication. So yes, it is for critical infrastructure, but if you look into the details, there are a lot of companies that fall under critical infrastructure. So pretty much a lot of the companies right now have to look at that, have to look at how they are treating this, how they are fulfilling the regulations that are coming out, that are evolving. NIS2 is very clear on you have to have ways of backup communication. And of course, this is also coming up in customer situations and customer communications, and they have to be like secure as well, because especially in the situations that come up, then this is what they are looking for.
And isn't there now, from what I am familiar with in terms of in NIS2, isn't there also a real concern about securing supply chains?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a digital resilience and security aspect to that too. I mean, obviously, and how we control communications, because if you are dependent on a supply chain and that supply chain gets compromised or somehow breaks down, you're just as much of, in a problem as if you were directly compromised. So I believe that regulatory sort of mechanism also heavily addresses supply chain risks.
Absolutely, 100%. This is definitely something we're seeing, and it's included. Like it includes also a big risk.
And
we have seen this. We have seen this during the COVID era, right, where we found out how important supply chains are, and that supply chains are still working. And I think this is also one of the reasons why we're now working towards securing the logistics the platforms for that. Is that also what you're seeing here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that comes to mind is that when you think about supply chain, obviously there's the direct, let's just say if you're in some manufacturing of some sort and you have a supply chain, where you're getting physical goods, that's one aspect. But there's also a very, pretty much every organization of any size now has an extensive digital supply chain. And digital supply chains tend to be where vulnerabilities and attackers come through. The lowest common denominator of security becomes the vulnerability by which even the high guarded fortress gets compromised, right? It's through the back door, as it were, where the supplies are brought in. This is the kind of there's a risk to that, which ties again to the systemic risks, of what kind of suppliers do you rely on? What is their systems risk? How much can you trust them? And that's something where, and even we see cloud security providers getting hacked at a global level, right? So you see the impact of a supply chain provider that on a digital basis that's actually even supplying security goods that if it's not taking the right precautions can become a source of compromise itself. So that it makes me think about, yes, the traditional supply chains we think about, like food or supplies or building materials, these sorts of things, but there's also the digital side as well that needs to be paid attention to.
Absolutely. Alex, we talked a lot about the risks and why are we even talking about this? Why is this important? But I think let's switch gears a little bit and talk about what does good actually look like. So what are the solutions? What can we do? What can companies, what can governments, what can governmental organizations do to really get on top of all of this?
Well, I think there's a couple of things I'll start off with. One is clearly there's a state of mind, right? What we're trying to do, why we spend so much time on the problem, is that the problem is actually quite severe. It's very extensive and complicated. And there's a state of mind change needed to just simply acknowledge that. If you start to pay attention, then of course it's an unpleasant realization of how much risk there is. But that's the first step, that those risks are real. But beyond that, I think, what good looks like, before we get to, products or solutions or specific technologies, is really about having a sound assessment of your organization's risk. Every organization's risk is different because what types of data, what kind of work habits, what kind of supply chain, who do you depend on, what are the nature of threats. Some organizations are targeted by nation state actors, like big, obvious critical industries and government and things like that, and some are not, right? The risk profiles are different. What are your highest risk points? What's really important for you to protect against? How does that relate to the kinds of things that are being communicated about and exchanged, on an internal basis where those risk points are there? I think the assessment is a big part of it. Awareness and then assessment comes next. And then I think, this is maybe I'm sure that in your role you get into those sorts of assessment questions. So I'd love to hear a little bit of your perspectives on that. But also, to me, like what comes next is, how do you then formulate a sound strategy? So I'd love to hear what you see customers do in the best cases to figure that out.
Yeah. You're 100% right with the risk assessment. This is what you really need to look at first. What are your risks, or what are the risks that you want to protect against? That's probably the right question, because there are so many different risks, so many different risk classes, and then you really need to figure that out first. After that, the next step that we're seeing from customers is, okay, what's our strategy to reduce the risk from all of these threats? What are the most important ones? What are the ones that are really our highest priority? And if they found a way for that, really have this strategy in place, then the next step is actually identifying what are the right solutions for this? How can I find a secure and sovereign alternative to what I'm doing right now? And there are a couple of topics that I do see. I would love to get your thoughts as well on this, that you really need to look at when you're identifying a solution to reduce the risk. So I think one thing that's super important.
But can I just interrupt you for a second?
Of course.
I mean, and I'm just going to play devil's advocate here.
Mm-hmm.
We think about strategy, but is it really as simple as considering alternatives? Sometimes when you think about strategy, you feel like you need to come up with a 7-point plan. It needs to be 40 pages long, that sort of thing. Yeah. But I mean, what I'm hearing, but I also think it's important to recognize, and I do think it's true, that oftentimes it's just saying, what is the better option?
Absolutely.
Right? Like strategy is like, okay, we need to improve in this area. Here's the highest risk points. What are our alternatives? What are the better options? A versus B, and strategy can, should lead to some like high actionability like that. But I just point that out. So sometimes it's like strategy, and then you go to options, and like, that sounds too simplistic. But I think what we're saying is that this is just sort of like, this is practical.
This is probably where I'm coming from. Is I want it to be that easy. I want to have this 7-step plan, but you're right. There is no 7-step plan, and the development of the strategy differs from company to company because the risk profiles are different. That's also something that you need to consider. Not for every company. They have no company, like similar companies have the similar risks, but there are different ways of addressing those and then really getting into the alternatives. And the other thing where I also like have my approval, where you have my approval, is like, it's super important that you find the better solution. It's not always the best one. Like, right. Sometimes there's
no perfect. You can't get no perfect.
Right? In security, there is no perfect. So the first thing that I learned when I learned about security is there is no perfect. There just isn't. So you have to find the best possible solution, and for that, it's important.
And also, people are. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, people are living within a constrained world of like, you have time, you have budget, you have people. You're not going to all of a sudden develop your own software, that sort of thing. So it is oftentimes just come down to like managing your portfolio with alternatives that improve your stance over time.
And this is exactly where you can look at the options that are out there in the market. And like, to give some real practical advice on this, like stuff that you can really look at, or that I would look at, is first of all, solutions that are end-to-end encrypted. Like end-to-end encryption is super, super important, just to make sure that there is no way of interfering with the data. And I'm not talking about encryption at rest and in transit only. I'm really talking about the true end-to-end encryption, where we have a zero trust, zero knowledge architecture in the background, especially zero knowledge from a vendor perspective, so that there's really no way of interfering with the data and really getting in the middle of this. I think those are a couple of key topics. Open source is something that I'm getting asked a lot about, like open source transparency, also the transparency of the development of the software that is really there. I've seen other topics like deployment flexibility, also something that we talk about a lot. It's like, yes, cloud is fine. If I want to protect against the risk of the internet connection being down, I need to be flexible in the deployment. So I need to have a solution that is also working on premise. Those are kind of the key things. Do you see more things?
There's a couple of things that come to mind. Yeah, one is just, we're talking about digital sovereignty and sort of legal overreach on a geopolitical basis. Those sorts of things. You want to understand whose laws the software obeys, right? And practically, not just in marketing, but and actually, is there true accountability to which regulatory and legal schemes? I think the other thing is, can it scale? Can it handle? It's also well and good if you have a quote unquote secure solution, but if it can't scale to the need that you have, then it won't be practically usable. Those are a couple extra additional points I think about. One thing I want to just point out is that just to emphasize what you talk about in terms of end-to-end security and zero trust and zero knowledge, I think the whole idea of the reason for end-to-end encryption, where the encryption happens at the end devices and nothing in between can actually see into the communications, not the server, not servers, not admins, that there's that's kind of really what we mean by when we say there's zero knowledge. That the architecture that actually makes it all go can't see into it. There's no way to compromise it. And that stands in contrast. That sort of approach is very much in contrast to the, hey, I'm going to trust a cloud security provider, but they have godlike access to everything. So if their admin gets compromised, every one of the customers is compromised. And we've seen this happen. So it's important to remember that, sure, people will say things are encrypted, but that doesn't, end-to-end encryption and zero trust and zero knowledge architecture are distinct and actually a little more rare than they should be, even with quote unquote cloud security providers. So something to just be aware of.
Alex, I'm being conscious of time and just looking at where we are with our discussion.
Yeah.
The one thing that I would really like to offer everyone that watches this is some real things, like real opportunities on how can you get started, like really addressing this topic. What can companies do right now to get started with the process of becoming more secure? Do you want to start with a couple of ideas around this, and then maybe I can chime in?
Well, I think first of all that choose an entry point where you don't have anything, and we pointed out crisis communications or fallback or out-of-band communications. That's a natural point where most organizations really just don't have anything in place, and it's a great way to onboard. I think that there's pretty much any organization, whether you're under NIS2 or not, if you have significant data to protect, and that's a great place to start, very practically speaking. That's the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, definitely. I have a couple of other things that I have seen also from customers, how they started. And I think for me, one of the best things is, people are using insecure communication. It's just a fact. This is happening. Get the use cases. Like, really talk to your employees, talk to the people and ask them why, not only why they're using it, but also how they're using it. This could be a really, really good start to then look at alternatives. What can you offer as alternatives? What do you need to keep in the back of your mind in terms of looking at what can be the better topic for this?
So, for example, you're talking about why, in what cases are employees, and having an open and candid and safe conversation about why do you use WhatsApp? When do you use it?
Exactly.
What would work? What would you need to satisfy that use case so we can keep your work going, but we can keep our organization safe and secure?
And they might answer with stuff that you can't fulfill, like at first glance. They might come up with, hey, I'm using that on my personal devices. And maybe you then need to start thinking, okay, if they're using that on their personal devices, why are they using it there? Is there a way we can enable those personal devices even with a highly secure messaging solution that then still works, although you don't have a bring your own device policy at work in general? Like, those are the things that you really need to start thinking about, because otherwise they just continue using it.
Obviously Wire provides a solution in this space, and maybe as we finish up, I would love you to share an anecdote about, a customer that you have worked with, or that we've worked with, and what was the point A that they started with their challenge, and and what did they end up doing, and what was the thing that they, what was a big concern? How did they solve it? Outside of product and features and things like that. Do you have a story or two that you can just share quickly on that?
I would say the story that we're hearing the most is people are just using WhatsApp. And one example that came up when we're talking about in industries where you have a lot of people that need to coordinate their work, like have working plans, for example, in place. Think about fitness studios, think about retail, think about cafes, like all those kind of organizations where you have a lot to coordinate and where you have plans for your employees. In, I would say, 90% of the times, I heard, hey, we are sharing this via an insecure method.
Yeah.
That's what comes up all the time. And that's where they want to start with. They really want to get rid of insecure messages, of sharing internal information. It can also be that, and this is also something that I've seen, that they're shared pay slips via WhatsApp, for example, because they have so many people that they need to care about that don't have access to internal systems. That's what they do. Like they're just sharing super important information, but also information that shouldn't go public through an insecure messaging solution.
Yeah. I mean, there's a huge category of people who work in those things where they don't get a corporate device. So, right, that's a huge concern.
And then we have a solution as Wire where they don't need to have a corporate device, where we can make sure that the communication between the company and the employee is really highly secured in an end-to-end encrypted way. And that's how we're starting in a lot of the times.
Yeah. I think, we are sort of running against a time boundary here, but I do know that, categorically, we will also work with, a lot of governments, NGOs around the world, that they're concerned with nation state and just cybercrime threats to their work. We're also seeing a lot of customers starting to reconsider whether or not they want to get a European alternative to Teams, for example. That's coming up more, as well as organizations that have had Skype for Business that they need to replace, and they want something that will be secure to replace that. So, yeah.
Maybe giving you two concrete examples for that, like for governments and NGOs. One thing that we're seeing is in governments or in political parties where we're talking about confidential and classified chats. So one thing can be, hey, if a voting is called inside the Bundestag, for example, a political party needs needs to ping everybody that they need to join this voting immediately. This is something that we can enable, that we enabled. Or one thing that I just recently talked to a customer about was really interesting. Their use case was, hey, we already have a backup solution. So our primary solution is MS Teams, and our backup solutions is MS Teams in a different data center. So what they basically wanted to do is reduce the risk of Teams in general falling down. So that's also one of the things where we were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, so backup systems, crisis communications, replacing consumer apps, replacing out-of-date apps, and unsanctioned apps, that sort of thing. There's a lot of opportunities that, if you probably think about it, it's not hard to think about one that you probably could get started with.
Yeah, 100%.
So I think, just to wrap things up here, what we've talked about is that the problem is real. It's now the threats are rising, and the threat environment is getting more intense. Human risk is always there, and this is becoming, and collaboration is at the center of work today. So there's so much sensitive data, and the threat environment is advancing so much. It's too big to ignore. So just the big encouragement is, please don't ignore this issue, right? And the second thing is that secure, end-to-end encrypted, digitally sovereign, zero trust, zero knowledge solutions are available today. This is achievable. This is not something that is exotic. There are a lot of organizations doing this. We're helping many of them. we're not the only one, but we do consider ourselves a leader in this field, and we are helping many with that, many organizations with that. And I think my encouragement out of this is that we're here to help. We're here to have a constructive conversation, dialogue with you if you as an organization are needing to think through your next steps, even aside from specific product things, like how can we help you as an organization think through your risks, your strategy, and how you can move forward. So that's some of the things I think of as a final takeaway. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, though.
Absolutely. And I think especially the last one, if there was one thing that I want to really hand out here, is we've done it before. Like, we are talking to corporates, we're talking to government organizations, we're talking to NGOs daily, multiple times. We've heard all of their requirements. We heard a lot about the risks that they are seeing. We can really help you and bring that knowledge also to you in terms of, we talked about the assessment that is necessary. Like, one of the first steps is assess your own risk. We've done that before. We are talking to customers about this. So reach out to us, let us help you, and then we're super happy to get you onto a highly secure, end-to-end encrypted communication and collaboration solution.
Great. Well, with that, thanks, Mark, for the conversation. I think, obviously it's such an important topic that is growing in awareness across the sort of IT landscape. So with that, I think we're gonna transition to some Q&A.
Yes, thank you so much, Mark and Alex, for that great presentation. And like you said, it's time for the Q&A portion of the webinar, and we did get a few questions throughout. So to kick things off, the first question we got was, great input. How do you think CISOs and businesses should actually go about evaluating their collaboration stack to prep for 2026? And what are the first steps?
It's a good question. So, I mean, I think the couple of things, I'll start with this, is I think from a top-down perspective, I think you want to look at whether you have major use case gaps, like we talked about. Do you have, if you're honest, is there likely to be a good deal of shadow IT risk in your organization? Apps that should not be used for sensitive communications, that expose your organization to cybersecurity, compliance, other risks. Those risks have a very high price tag. So if I'm a CISO, then I'm going to be looking at the total impact of that risk from a point of view of major use case gaps, unsanctioned sort of app use, and how that how those things create a certain, let's say, economic, if you're a business, you can assess the economics of that risk, have an analyst do an assessment of that. And that will give you a view as to whether or not, how big that should factor into your portfolio of initiatives from a top-down perspective. That's where I would think from a, an IT leadership or a CISO point of view. Mark, do you have something you would like to add to that?
I think you brought it already to the point, Alex. Thanks for that. Are there any more questions, Laura?
Yes, I have a few more. Next question was, what does a secure on-premise setting look like?
Now, that's an
opposite end. Yeah,
Sorry,
probably
technical question, but that's a good one. That's a good one.
It's a really good question, and we could probably talk about this for quite some time. Usually, we're doing a larger assessment on what secure does look like for you. What I think, or what we have also seen, how customers are implementing this. First of all, I think it's important that on-premise deployments are super secure, obviously, and they're only used in highly secure environments. Still, those companies or governments or NGOs have the need to also talk to people outside of their organizations. So outside of the on-prem setting that they currently have. We're seeing that with governments, for example, that they really have their own internal network, and nobody can get in unless you're in that network. We're not even talking about VPNing in. It's like, this is a closed shop, come to the office, this is where you can work. There, you definitely need one specific instance of Wire that I would propose as for the on-premise. And if you then additionally have the need to communicate with the outside world, or in the case of a government, with other governmental organizations, for example, I would suggest a second instance that is then connected to other secure organizational instances of Wire, but have a bridge towards the highly secure environment, so that you can then really also communicate there. And if you want, that's also one possibility. If you need to communicate to the outside world, into the cloud world, you could have a third instance that then is really also connected to the internet, where you can then talk to others, to people outside of your internal realm. So this 3-zone model is something that we're seeing quite a bit.
So I think that, sorry, Alex, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, that 3-zone approach, it sounds like it takes advantage of like a secure federation model of some sort, right? Because exactly. I know that's something, Wire supports a very sophisticated secure federation, but that's obviously something that's needed for that.
100%. So you really need to make sure that they can talk to each other, the different instances, and based on the federation model that we have, this is super easy to do.
So I think actually the next question really plays well off the conversation, or just off what you guys just said. And it's, when should you choose cloud versus on-premise deployments? But I think you kind of touched on that a little bit already. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add.
Yeah, maybe just one quick thing on that. So on-premise, as we talked about, is for highly secure environments. Also, where you need to, where you're working with classified documents, for example, with classified material. This is something that we're seeing where you would have the on-prem environment. For most company, clouds is the tool of choice. It's as easy as that. And what we're also seeing is that based on MLS, the underlying architecture that we implemented in Wire, it actually adds a new level of security. So we're also seeing that people that even if they are in a really highly regulated industry or highly regulated environment, they, based on the encryption level that we're already bringing with the MLS standard, they're turning to the cloud because they're saying, hey, this is so secure, it's end-to-end, it's zero knowledge, zero trust. So we can totally use the cloud, and we don't necessarily have to put an on-premise system in place.
And just to unpack that, since we didn't, I mean, this wasn't meant to be a tutorial webinar on specific technical topics, but MLS being, sort of the IETF standard for, highly scalable, extremely robust key exchange, and that key exchange is really what makes end-to-end encryption as secure as it can be and work at a highly performant, highly scalable level. That's something that Wire was part of pioneering that standard, and is one of the few, organizations that actually has implemented this at scale in its product. So, it's something that is sort of like it's not cutting edge in the sense that it's unsafe. It's just at the leading edge. It is the leading edge of, encryption key exchange technology, and Wire has that.
Alrighty, just keep in mind, we just have a few more minutes. I do have 2 more questions to ask you guys. So kind of segueing here a little bit, is how much impact can implementing secure communications have on security and compliance risk for the organization?
Okay, that's a kind of a wrinkle of sort of a somewhat earlier question, but the way that you want to calculate that is the term that's used is risk-adjusted loss avoidance. Essentially, as an organization, you're going to typically, your finance team is, or should be, probably budgeting for losses, right? You have to, risk is about like, losses that can occur to, let's say, to the business. And so basically there's a budget for losses due to cybersecurity breaches, compliance failures, regulatory fines, things like that. So one of the ways you can quantify this is to say, for example, how I was talking to Forrester analysts, and they were talking about that the amount of exposure that email has, or systems that are deeply tied into email. For example, Teams is directly tied into the same systems that run all the email, right, for you. Is that level of exposure is probably 100 times higher than a segmented, secure, end-to-end secure communication system like Wire, for example. It's 100x more risky, right, in terms of potentially compromised data or users, that sort of thing. So by taking your sensitive communications and moving them to something like Wire, which is segmented, end-to-end encrypted, zero knowledge, zero trust, you dramatically reduce the potential of data breaches due to human errors, due to attacks, things like that. And you can then say, all right, out of the maybe millions and millions of euros we have to budget for losses, we can take off of the table a fair amount or a good chunk of that potential risk on an annualized basis. It's very easy then to make the business case for why you can make an investment in a category of tool that would save you that risk. So that's kind of a truncated explanation, but that's sort of how you would go about it.
Okay, and last question, but just to be mindful, we do have 3 more minutes. Where are IT leaders in Europe at in terms of taking action on these security and sovereignty concerns?
What I have heard both from IT leaders and what we hear, as well as what I hear from the IT analyst community, is that pretty much every IT leader that we know of and that I've heard about through industry analysts is now making plans. You may have a license commitment to a major provider of some type of system for a few years. You may have, but we see that most IT leaders are now considering alternatives. They may not be able to do it today, but they're starting to make plans for alternatives to decrease their exposure. It's not flipping a switch from, it's going to go from on to off. It's about an evolution. And we see IT leaders across Europe taking that pretty seriously. And we saw that also in data. Wire did a survey of IT leaders and their concerns, and we saw a good indication of the concern level there.
All righty. Well, thank you so much, Alex and Mark, and thank you all of you for joining us today for this really awesome and informative conversation on secure communication. We hope you enjoyed joining us today and that you will join us next time for our upcoming webinar in the new year. And just a reminder, you will receive a copy of the webinar in your inbox as well following today's event. And have a great day. Bye now.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.